Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive, your resource when you really need that comprehensive understanding. Today, we're not just looking at pretty pictures from vacation spots. We're doing, well, almost an essential triage on what many call the most valuable real estate in the ocean. We are plunging deep into the complex, architecturally incredible world of coral reefs.
That's absolutely right. And those images you usually see. Crystal clear water, bright fish. They honestly barely scratch the surface of how important these ecosystems are. Our mission today, our deep dive, is really to cut through the general awareness and give you that high-level conceptual clarity. We need to get into exactly how corals work, why they're basically essential infrastructure for marine life and for protecting our coasts, and crucially, how the current crisis, driven by these linked threats like bleaching and acidification, is fundamentally threatening, the global food supply and even the physical security of coastal communities.
We're pulling together some really intensive sources today, focusing on these vital marine habitats. They're often called the tropical rainforests of the oceans. And that nickname, as we'll definitely see, is earned purely through their sheer biological productivity. Okay, let's get down to the absolute basics here. Where does this massive, complex structure even begin? What's the starting point?
Right, it all starts at the micro level with the individual coral polyp. These are actually colonies of tiny animals, and they grow quite slowly. They're the fundamental builders. But the really critical biological concept here, the heart of it, is that reef-building corals just don't exist on their own. Their very survival, and therefore the survival of the entire reef ecosystem, depends completely on this amazing non-negotiable symbiotic partnership. They live together with microscopic algae called Zooxanthellae.
The symbiosis. This is that critical mutual relationship, right? The sort of $1 plus 1 over 10 equation that really defines the whole reef system.
Yeah.
Can you break down the give and take for us? What's the animal doing for the plant, and what's the plant doing for the animal?
Okay, so the coral polyp, that's the animal part. It provides a safe, stable home. Think of it like a living fortress for the Zooxanthellae. It also gives the algae the essential compounds they need to kickstart photosynthesis, things like carbon dioxide and nitrogenous waste products from the coral itself.
Okay, so shelter and raw materials.
Exactly. And in return, the Zooxanthellae, which are technically plants, tiny algae, they live inside the coral's tissue. And they work incredibly hard, generating huge amounts of energy through photosynthesis. They actually supply the coral polyps with up to, get this, 90% of the energy they need to survive and build the reef.
90%. Wow, that sounds less like a partnership and more like, well, almost total energy dependence.
It really is.
And this brings us back to that fascinating contradiction you mentioned, the one we found in the source material, the nutrient paradox. If these reefs are so incredibly productive, so biologically rich, like a rainforest, as we said, how on earth do they manage to thrive in those crystal clear, almost sterile-looking tropical waters? Waters that are basically marine deserts just outside the reef.
That is the core puzzle, and the answer is key to understanding them. The surrounding ocean water is often very poor in nutrients. Oligotrophic is the term. Yet the reef itself supports this phenomenal level of productivity. How? It's only possible because the entire biological community, with that polyp-algae symbiosis right at the center, has developed an absolutely enormous capacity to recycle scarce nutrients. It's incredibly efficient. So instead of losing vital nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus out into the open ocean, they're captured immediately, they're rapidly reprocessed, and they're locked tightly within the biological system. It's all about this tight resource coupling.
So the whole system is basically engineered for maximal efficiency. It minimizes waste, instantly reabsorbs anything useful. Like a self-sustaining nutrient pump sitting right in the middle of, well, a biological wasteland.
Precisely. That's the biological engine. Now, because this partnership is so specialized, so finely tuned.
It must need very specific conditions to work properly.
Exactly. It demands an extremely narrow, predictable environmental window. If things go outside that window, the system starts to break down.
Okay, let's define that window. What are the specific, non-negotiable environmental conditions needed for healthy reef-building corals to form and thrive?
Right. The source material highlights several key physical requirements. The first one, and the one causing the most trouble globally right now, is temperature. Corals live within an incredibly tight temperature range. Just being exposed for a prolonged time to water that's even 1 or 2 degrees Celsius above their usual maximum summer temperature, it's devastating. This sensitivity to thermal stress is probably their single biggest vulnerability factor worldwide today.
And because of their plant partners, the Zooxanthellae, sunlight must be absolutely critical too, which ties into water quality, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. For the Zooxanthellae to photosynthesize effectively, they need plenty of sunlight. This means two things. Coral reefs generally have to form in relatively shallow depths where light can penetrate easily. And, crucially, they demand high water clarity. Clear water is non-negotiable. Turbidity, that's cloudiness from suspended particles, and sedimentation, where particles actually settle on the coral. These are huge stressors.
Often from land-based runoff or coastal development.
Often, yes. Poor land use, agriculture, construction. It washes sediment into the sea. This can literally smother the coral polyps or just block the sunlight the algae need. Either way, it's bad news.
Okay, so stable temperature, shallow depth, clear water. What about the water chemistry itself?
They need optimal salinity. The concentration of salt in the water needs to be pretty stable. Any sudden large influx of fresh water, maybe from heavy rainfall, major river runoff, or perhaps even glacier melt in some areas, can drastically reduce the salinity. This shocks the coral system and causes stress.
Okay.
And finally, there's a physical factor. They generally cannot tolerate subaerial exposure.
Meaning being exposed to the air.
Exactly. Even relatively brief exposure during extremely low tides, sometimes called spring tides, can cause severe thermal shock, desiccation, drying out, and significant stress.
Wow. It really is a miracle that such vast, complex structures can be built on such a delicate, sensitive biological foundation. Okay, let's zoom out a bit, move to the macro scale. We mentioned the tropical rainforests of the oceans analogy. Let's really analyze why these fragile ecosystems are conceptually seen that way.
Yeah, it's a powerful analogy, and it holds up well. It really comes down to the sheer complexity and the density of life they support. Think about terrestrial rainforests. They're known for two main things: staggering biodiversity, just tons of different species, and extremely high net productivity, even though the soil itself might be relatively nutrient poor.
Right.
Corals mirror this perfectly. Despite being in those nutrient-poor waters we've talked about, that incredibly tight recycling loop allows them to sustain a vast number of different species.
Yeah.
They are true biodiversity hotspots. They act as habitat, as nursery grounds, as feeding areas for literally thousands upon thousands of species: invertebrates, fish, other vertebrates, marine plants, you name it.
So the sheer concentration of life is comparable to the most diverse places we find on land. Beyond just counting species, though, what are their tangible functions? How do they directly benefit human society?
Oh, the functions are profound, and they go way beyond just being pretty. Ecologically, they're critical. Think about coastal protection. Coral reefs act as enormous, natural, submerged breakwaters. They absorb incredible amounts of wave energy. Studies have shown that a healthy reef can actually reduce up to 90%, maybe even more, of the incoming wave energy before it even reaches the shore.
90%, that's huge.
It is. This protection shields coastlines from erosion. It significantly lessens the damage from increasingly severe storms, which we're seeing more of with climate change, and it even provides a pretty effective buffer against tsunamis.
That right there shifts the conversation beyond just ecology and straight into essential infrastructure, doesn't it? Losing a reef isn't just an environmental tragedy. It's a massive physical security risk and a huge economic liability for coastal nations.
Precisely. And that directly highlights their immense economic and societal value. Reefs are enormous economic engines. They drive massive global industries worth billions of dollars, particularly tourism and recreation. People travel the world to see healthy reefs.
Sure, snorkeling, diving.
Exactly. But maybe even more fundamentally, they underpin commercial fisheries all around the globe. Many commercially important fish species depend entirely on the reef structure, especially as nursery grounds for their young, their juvenile stages. So the loss of reefs leads directly to severe socioeconomic problems, even potentially collapse, in coastal communities that rely heavily on these resources for their food security and their livelihoods.
Yeah, and if you look at it purely through a policy or economic lens, the cost of trying to replace that natural coastal protection barrier with engineered structures like seawalls, it vastly outweighs the cost of actually protecting and conserving the living reef itself.
Absolutely. It's irreplaceable natural infrastructure. The value is almost incalculable.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now to the physical structures themselves, the morphology. We know they build these huge structures. The source material breaks down three main types of coral reef structures. Let's start with the one that's most closely connected to the land, the fringing reef.
Right, the fringing reef. This is actually the most common type you'll find globally, and it's structurally the simplest. It's essentially a platform reef that grows directly outwards from the shore or the coastline. It means it's closely attached to the landmass itself. This closeness, this intimate proximity, means a couple of things. Fringing reefs are often the youngest type of reef formation, but critically, it also makes them the most vulnerable to land-based threats, pollution runoff from agriculture or industry, sewage discharge, and especially that sedimentation problem we discussed, caused by human activity on the adjacent land.
Makes sense. Then you have the really enormous, sometimes iconic structures, the barrier reefs. What's the key geological feature that separates them from the fringing type?
The defining characteristic is separation. A barrier reef is distinctly separated from the mainland coast by a significant body of water, usually a wider, deeper channel or a lagoon.
Okay, so there's a gap.
Yes, a substantial gap. This separation means the lagoon itself often develops its own unique sheltered ecosystem, protected from the force of the open ocean waves by the barrier reef further out. And of course, when you talk about barrier reefs, the prime example, the archetype on a global scale, is the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia. Just immense.
Absolutely. And finally, perhaps the most intriguing formation visually, the atoll reef. They often look like those perfect rings of coral floating seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The formation story here sounds like a geological race against time.
Yeah, atolls are fascinating. Their formation is really defined by this cycle of, well, life and death, or maybe more accurately, growth and geological decay, or subsidence. Atolls are typically circular or maybe semicircular reefs that enclose a central lagoon. Their formation happens because the coral initially started growing around the fringes of a volcanic island. Then, over vast stretches of geological time, millions of years, that central volcanic island slowly sinks. It subsides below sea level. The key is that the upward growth of the living coral manages to keep pace with this sinking.
So the coral is constantly building upwards, trying to stay in that sunlit, shallow zone as the foundation beneath it sinks away.
That's exactly it. It's a slow-motion geological competition. The coral polyps are perpetually building towards the light, outpacing the downward pull of gravity and the sinking seafloor. Eventually, the volcanic peak disappears completely beneath the waves, leaving just the ring-like reef structure enclosing the lagoon where the island used to be.
What happens if the coral can't keep up? If the island sinks too fast or the coral dies back for some reason?
Well, if the reef building doesn't manage to keep pace with the subsidence, maybe growth is too slow, or there's some environmental stress that kills off the coral, then the structures just can't reach the surface light anymore. They become permanently submerged banks or platforms. We see these submerged structures in various parts of the world, representing reefs that lost that race against subsidence.
Fascinating. Okay, let's bring this geography closer to home now. India has some incredible, very diverse reef systems. For our listeners who need to kind of map this out, where are the 4 major coral reef areas in India located, and how do they stack up in terms of their overall species richness or diversity?
Right. India's reefs are quite spread out geographically, and they vary a lot in their structure and health. The source material ranks them based on species diversity, with the richest area listed first.
Okay, give us the ranking. Who's at the top?
Number 1, exhibiting the highest species diversity by far, are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in the Bay of Bengal. Their geographical location, sort of remote and relative isolation, has helped maintain their relatively pristine nature and really high biodiversity.
Okay, A and N first, then followed by the island chains on the western side of the peninsula.
Correct. Coming in second place are the Lakshadweep Islands in the Arabian Sea. After Lakshadweep, we have the Gulf of Mannar in third place. That's located off the southeastern coast of Tamil Nadu. And finally, ranking 4th in overall species richness is the Gulf of Kutch in Gujarat, up on the northwest coast.
That ranking itself, ANN, Lakshadweep, Mannar, Kutch, immediately suggests there must be significant ecological differences between these sites. Can you highlight maybe a unique characteristic or a specific challenge faced by each of these major Indian reef areas?
Certainly. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are quite unique because you find extensive mangrove forests growing in very close association with the coral reefs there. This mangrove-coral relationship is ecologically critical. The mangroves help stabilize shorelines and trap sediment that might otherwise wash onto the reefs and damage the corals. It's a beneficial pairing.
Interesting. What about Lakshadweep? You mentioned the ranking. What's unique there?
The defining feature of the Lakshadweep Islands is their structure. They are entirely composed of atolls. This reflects that specific geological subsidence history we just discussed. They're classic examples of atoll formation. And the source even notes specific ecosystem details, like significant seagrass beds growing on the Cavarati Atoll, which provide really important habitat for species like dugongs and sea turtles.
Right. And the two Gulf regions, Manar and Kash, they sound like they might face much more direct human pressure, being closer to the mainland.
They definitely do. The Gulf of Mannar is under significant stress from various human activities, but it's also crucial because it was one of India's first marine biosphere reserves, so it has a long history of conservation focus, even if challenges remain. The Gulf of Kach arguably faces the greatest challenges. It's located in a region with major industrial centers and busy port activities. The corals there are quite remarkable, actually. They're naturally adapted to a very tough environment with high levels of natural turbidity and huge fluctuations in temperature and salinity because of the massive tidal range in that gulf. Their very survival there shows incredible resilience, but also means they're living right on the edge, making them highly vulnerable to any additional stress caused by human activities.
And the source also mentions some smaller patches.
Yes. We should also note that there are minor fringing reefs found in pockets along the mainland coast, like near Malvan in Maharashtra, and maybe some patches off the coast of Palka Bay as well. These add to the overall regional diversity, even if the four main areas hold the bulk of India's reefs.
That detailed geographical picture is absolutely essential context for understanding the threats, which, as you mentioned earlier, now loom larger than ever before. This brings us squarely to the crisis that's dominating global headlines regarding reefs: coral bleaching. Now, we need to be really clear here. Bleaching itself isn't a specific disease, is it? It's more like the coral's general visible response when it's under extreme stress.
That is the absolutely critical conceptual point to grasp. Bleaching is a sign of systemic failure. It's the visible outcome when the coral organism is overwhelmed, often by multiple stressors acting together, pushing that delicate polyp-algae relationship past its breaking point. And because corals exist within that incredibly narrow thermal window we talked about, even a relatively small but sustained increase in water temperature can be enough to trigger this catastrophic response on a massive scale.
Okay, so let's get into the precise biological mechanism. Once that stress threshold, usually high temperature, is crossed, how does the coral physically end up expelling its vital life partner, the Zooxanthellae? What actually happens inside the coral?
Right. When the coral is under significant stress, particularly thermal stress, the metabolic processes start to malfunction. Specifically, within the Zooxanthellae, the process of photosynthesis can go haywire and start producing harmful reactive oxygen species. You can think of these as toxic byproducts.
Okay, so the algae become toxic to the host.
In a sense, yes. The coral polyp senses this internal danger, this toxicity building up, and it initiates a drastic physical response to protect itself. This involves the detachment and eventually the expulsion of these specialized host cells, the cnidarian endodermal cells, that actually contain the algae. The coral literally ejects the algae-filled cells.
It pushes out its partner, and since the algae are what give the coral its vibrant colors, when they're ejected...
Exactly. The coral's own tissue is actually transparent. So when the colorful algae are gone, what you see is the stark white of the underlying calcium carbonate skeleton showing through, hence the term bleaching.
Is the coral dead at this point?
Not immediately. Critically, a bleached coral is not necessarily dead yet, but it is severely weakened and essentially starving. Without the Zooxanthellae providing up to 90% of its food, it has very limited energy reserves. It can only survive in that bleached state for a short period, maybe days, perhaps a few weeks, depending on the species and conditions. If the stress continues and the algae don't return, mass mortality usually follows.
And while rising sea temperature is clearly identified as the overwhelming primary driver of these mass bleaching events we're seeing globally, what are the other kinds of physical triggers that can induce this same stress response in corals?
Well, pretty much any sudden, severe environmental change can potentially trigger bleaching, although temperature is the big one for mass events. Beyond temperature, we have other physical stressors. Extreme weather events like storms and high waves can cause direct physical damage, breaking coral branches and stirring up sediment, which increases turbidity and stress. Then there's that brief but potentially devastating exposure during subaerial exposure, when corals are left high and dry during extreme low tides or perhaps sudden localized sea level drops. This causes rapid heating or drying out.
Right.
And finally, sharp changes in the actual water composition can do it too. especially significant drops in salinity, perhaps caused by unusually heavy rainfall or major river flooding dumping freshwater onto the reef. This shocks the coral's internal fluid balance and can induce a bleaching response. Increased turbidity and sedimentation, as we mentioned, also fall under this category of water quality stressors.
So if rising temperature is the acute, rapid threat causing these dramatic mass die-offs, we now really need to turn to the other major climate change impact. This one is more like a silent, chronic threat that fundamentally undermines the coral's ability to build skeleton in the first place, or to recover even if temperatures stabilize. That's ocean acidification, or OA. This is the second catastrophic consequence stemming directly from all that excess carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere.
Exactly. And this provides a direct linkage for analysis, thinking about GS Paper 3 conservation, climate change impacts. The chemistry itself is fairly straightforward, but the implications are, frankly, terrifying. As atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rise, mainly from burning fossil fuels, a significant chunk of that extra CO2, maybe about a quarter to a third, gets absorbed directly by the surface layers of the ocean.
And the ocean doesn't just store the gas like a container, right? It actually reacts with it, changing the water's fundamental chemistry.
Precisely. When CO2 dissolves in seawater, H2O, it reacts to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. This carbonic acid then triggers a cascade of further chemical reactions in the water. The overall effect is twofold. First, it leads to an increase in the concentration of hydrogen ions, which means the acidity of the ocean increases. Technically, the pH level goes down. Second, and this is the absolutely critical part for anything that builds a shell or skeleton in the sea, it actively decreases the concentration of available carbonate ions, CO32.
Okay, carbonate ions. Let's go back to basics for the listener. Why is the reduction of those specific ions, CO32, so fundamentally vital for corals and actually for lots of other marine organisms too?
Carbonate ions are the essential raw building blocks. They're like the molecular bricks that marine organisms need for the process of calcification. Calcification is the biological process where organisms like hard corals, but also things like oysters, clams, mussels, sea urchins, even tiny planktonic organisms like pteropods and foraminifera extract calcium and carbonate ions from seawater to construct and maintain their hard, protective calcium carbonate, KCO3, shells and skeletons.
So they literally need to pull those carbonate ions out of the water to build their homes in their bodies.
Exactly. They combine calcium ions, which are generally plentiful, with these carbonate ions to form KCO3.
So if the water is becoming more acidic, and that process simultaneously reduces the available supply of these essential carbonate bricks, the whole job of building and maintaining those skeletons becomes much harder.
It becomes exponentially harder. It turns into a major metabolic energy drain for the organism. It's not just that there are fewer bricks available. It's that the organism has to expend significantly more of its precious energy. Energy it should be using for vital functions like growth, reproduction, or maybe fighting off disease, just to hunt down and incorporate those scarcer carbonate ions from the increasingly acidic water.
So it slows everything down?
It dramatically slows down the rate of calcification, the rate at which reefs can grow and accrete. In some cases, if the acidification gets severe enough, it can even tip the balance the other way, towards dissolution. This means the seawater itself becomes corrosive enough to start actively dissolving existing calcium carbonate structures faster than the organisms can possibly build new ones.
Wow.
The potential consequences of this for the entire marine food web, from the base up to commercially vital fisheries that depend on shelled organisms, are potentially catastrophic. It's a huge slow-motion crisis unfolding alongside the temperature increases.
A true double whammy from climate change. Okay. We've established the enormous value of reefs and the immense pressures they're under. Now, let's look at the response. What legal and conservation frameworks does India have in place to try and protect these incredibly sensitive ecosystems, especially given the constant pressure for coastal development?
India does utilize a fairly robust legal framework, and the primary tool is centered on classifying these areas as high-priority conservation zones. Coral reefs, along with mangroves and some other sensitive coastal features, are categorized as ecologically sensitive areas under the Coastal Regulation Zone (CRZ) notification. Specifically, they fall under CRZ-A. This CRZ-A designation carries a significant restriction. Generally speaking, no new construction is permitted within these zones. The aim is to prevent development activities that could directly harm these fragile environments.
Generally no new construction, but the real world often involves balancing development needs with conservation. Are there any specific exceptions allowed within CRZA zones under the current regulations, perhaps for projects deemed essential?
Yes, the law does recognize that certain essential public infrastructure projects might sometimes need to be located within or pass through these zones. However, these exceptions are specific and require rigorous environmental scrutiny and clearance, and critically, they must not adversely affect the natural tidal flow patterns which are vital for coastal ecosystems. The permitted exceptions listed in the source include projects related to the Department of Atomic Energy, the laying of essential infrastructure like pipelines and transmission lines, the installation of crucial weather radar systems by the Indian Meteorological Department, particularly for cyclone prediction, and the construction of large-scale public transport infrastructure like Trans-Harbor Sea Links.
Okay, so strategic national infrastructure might get a cautious path for approval, but general commercial or residential development is effectively barred from CRZI. Who's actually responsible for enforcing these complex zoning rules on the ground?
The day-to-day enforcement and management rely heavily on the National Coastal Zone Management Authority, NCZMA, at the central level, and the state or union territory level Coastal Zone Management Authorities, CZMA. These authorities derive their power directly from Section 5 of the Environmental Protection Act, 1986. This powerful act gives them the statutory authority to issue directions and take all necessary measures for the protection, conservation, and overall improvement of the coastal environment. They are essentially the boots on the ground for implementing and monitoring the CRZ regulations.
Right. Now, beyond just zoning land use, conservation obviously needs to use the broader tools available for protecting wildlife itself. How are coral reefs and the vast array of marine life they support protected under India's main wildlife law, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972?
India employs a multi-pronged strategy here, using the provisions of the Wildlife Act. A key approach is establishing protected areas, PAs. Currently, marine biodiversity, explicitly including coral species and reef ecosystems, receives protection within a network of designated PAs. The source mentions this network includes 4 national parks, 96 sanctuaries, and 3 marine biosphere reserves spread across India's coastal states and islands. Within these PAs, activities that could harm the reef structure or its inhabitants are strictly regulated or prohibited.
And what about tackling the problem of illegal harvesting or trade in coral or associated marine species?
For that, specialized enforcement is crucial. The Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, WCCB, plays a vital role here. It's tasked with strengthening law enforcement capabilities specifically to combat illegal trade, poaching, and trafficking of wildlife, including marine life and its products, like coral jewelry or shells. And finally, India's commitment extends to the international stage as well. The source highlights that India has been a contracting party to the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands since 1981. While often associated with freshwater wetlands, Ramsar also covers coastal wetland ecosystems, including coral reefs, requiring parties to implement conservation and wise use programs for these critical habitats.
Okay, that covers the main conservation approaches. That brings us nicely to our dedicated chapter Q&A segment. We spent a good amount of time discussing the morphology, the different types of reefs. So I want to test the conceptual understanding, specifically contrasting the geological versus the purely biological aspects of their formation. What is the critical defining difference in the formation mechanism between a fringing reef and an atoll?
Okay, that's an excellent way to synthesize the key differences. The core difference lies fundamentally in the reef's relationship with the underlying landmass and, crucially, the role of geological subsidence. Let's take the fringing reef first. Its definition hinges on its origin. It grows directly outward from the existing shoreline or coastline. It forms as a relatively shallow platform reef that's closely attached to and often follows the contours of the adjacent land. Its growth is primarily horizontal, expanding outwards from the coast.
Right, directly connected to the land. And the atoll. How does subsidence change the story?
In complete contrast, an atoll is that characteristic ring-shaped reef, sometimes broken, enclosing a central lagoon. It originated as a fringing reef around a central volcanic island. The critical difference, the defining mechanism, is the geological component. That central island subsequently subsided slowly, over millions of years, completely sinking below sea level. The reef structure itself, therefore, is defined by the fact that its growth had to be primarily vertical, constantly growing upwards towards the sunlight, just managing to keep pace with the sinking volcanic foundation. This vertical race against subsidence is what leaves the characteristic circular structure enclosing the lagoon where the island's peak once stood. The geology dictates the final form.
It really is an incredible testament to the persistence of life of biology managing to keep pace with slow geological forces. Fantastic explanation. Okay, now for our final knowledge synthesis. Let's distill this down. We'll start with some quick recall pointers, those essential nuggets of information that need to stick immediately for rapid understanding, maybe for prelims focus.
Okay, for quick recall, lock these in. The crucial microscopic algae living inside corals are called Zooxanthellae. Remember that name. The primary overwhelming driver of mass coral bleaching events globally is rising sea temperatures due to climate change. In India, the top two locations for coral species diversity are the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, highest, followed by the Lakshadweep Islands. Remember, Lakshadweep is composed of atolls, and the definition of an atoll itself, it's that circular reef structure, often enclosing a lagoon, whereby coral growth outpacing island subsidence.
Perfect. Short, sharp, essential facts. Now let's move to the deeper analytical insights, the so what factor, the takeaways more relevant for mains analysis, thinking about conservation strategy and policy implications.
Right, for the mains perspective, the major insight is really understanding the intertwined nature of the global threats facing corals. The conservation challenge is fundamentally a dual one. It's being driven simultaneously by the acute stress of rapidly rising sea temperatures causing bleaching and the chronic, slower but equally devastating chemical stress of ocean acidification, hindering their ability to build skeletons. And since both of these threats, warming and acidification, are direct, unavoidable consequences of increased atmospheric CO2 concentration, the analysis has to conclude that local conservation efforts, while important, are ultimately insufficient on their own. They absolutely must be supported by massive, urgent, global-scale mitigation of carbon emissions. Anything less is just treating the symptoms while the underlying disease progresses.
That's a critical point. And the final piece of the mains analysis puzzle, really emphasizing the value proposition beyond just biodiversity.
It's hammering home the socioeconomic importance, particularly the coastal protection function. Reefs are not luxuries. They're essential natural infrastructure. Their role as natural barriers defending vulnerable coastlines from storms, erosion, and high wave energy is invaluable, especially in an era of increasing climate change impacts and sea level rise. The breakdown of this natural defense system is rapidly escalating into a serious issue of national security and long-term economic stability for all coastal nations, including India. Losing reefs forces governments and communities to confront the incredibly expensive and often less effective prospect of building artificial coastal defenses. Protecting the national asset is far more cost-effective.
Absolutely. Okay, that brings us towards the end. Here's a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to carry forward after this deep dive. We hear a lot, quite rightly, about the devastating loss of our terrestrial rainforests. Deforestation is a major global concern. But consider the ocean for a moment. If the rainforests of the sea, these incredibly productive, staggeringly biodiverse ecosystems that took millions of years to build through the slow, painstaking process of biological calcification, if they disappear within decades due to rapid, human-induced changes in temperature and chemistry, what percentage of total global marine life are we actually putting at risk? How many fisheries, how many livelihoods, and perhaps most sobering, how quickly could we possibly hope to recover an ecosystem whose very existence relies on a geological timescale, operating far beyond the human window of election cycles or even lifetimes?
That question of timescale and the urgency it implies is really what must drive meaningful action right now.
Indeed it must. We sincerely hope this deep dive has provided you with comprehensive clarity on both the staggering importance and the critical fragility of the world's coral reefs. Thank you for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.